universalization of education, and the National Literacy Mission. She has a Bachelor of Arts from the South Indian Educational Trust and Women's College, Chennai, followed by a short course in gemology at the Gemological Institute of India. In 1997, she established the Hyderabad Institute of Gem and Jewelry. It's very interesting to note that she can read, write, and speak 5 languages: English, Telugu, Tamil, Hindi, and French. She is also accomplished in the Indian dance form Kuchipudi, having been under the tutelage of the learned Kuchipudi exponent, late Dr. Vempati Chinna Satyam, for 13 years. May I now request the Honorable Minister, Dr. Purandeshwari, to please address the gathering today.
Mrs. Shobana, Pro Vice Chancellor, Professor B.N. Jain, Vice Chancellor, Mrs. Manjushri, Professor V.S. Rao, Director, Shri Chris Ramchandran, Professor M.S. Anand, faculty, distinguished invitees and parents seated before the dais, ladies and gentlemen, and last but not the least, dear students. I've just decided to take a small detour from the beaten track of reading a pre-prepared speech, which is already, I'm sure, with all of you. I mean, the reason why I decided to do so was after listening to what Shobana had to say on the education sector in our country, and having been in the Ministry for Human Resource Development for almost 6.5 to 7 years. I thought this would be an apt moment and occasion for me to share with not only the academia, but also the students of what governments are actually doing to support education, and more particularly in trying to impart qualitative education to the children of our country. And the other reason why I decided to do so was to ensure that the young generation who would be stepping out of the precincts of this institute would definitely go out a little more thorough and enriched on what further needs to be done beyond what the governments are already doing for education in our country. As I was listening in rapt attention to the speakers before me, I did hear them speak of the challenges that the education sector is fraught with in our own country. But then I must share this experience of mine when I had actually gone to attend an international forum on education. This was in England, and one of the ministers was asked to actually come onto the dais and speak about the challenges that the education sector in his country was actually facing. He spoke for an uninterrupted 15 minutes, speaking on the challenges, the issues that he as the education minister of that particular country was actually facing, and what needs to be done. As he was coming off the dais, I was invited to take his place on the dais to speak of the education sector in India. And as we were crossing paths, I whispered and asked him, "Sir, may I know the number of children going to your schools, the elementary education, in your country?" He widened his eyes, said, "Madam, we have a huge number of children going to schools in our country. We have 10 lakh of children going to schools in our country." And the thought that first crossed my mind immediately was that if a minister representing a country with 10 lakh children going to school in his country needs 15 minutes to speak of the challenges and issues that he faced as an education minister, then what would be, or how many minutes, or for that matter, hours, days, weeks, months, or years would I need to speak as a representative of a country which had 13 crore children going only to the government and government-aided schools? The reason why I decided to share this with you is to speak of the challenge that we have in our country. A country as large as India, and the challenge is not simply the geographical challenge that we have, but also the challenges in terms of numbers and the diversity. The diversity that our country encompasses today is not simply restrained or constrained to the geographical diversity that we have, but the diversity in terms of traditions, in terms of cultures, and even languages. So in a country with such great diversity, if we have to reach out to every child living in the remotest areas of the country, belonging to the last rung of society, I must say we must appreciate all that governments have been trying to do to reach out to these children. This is not to overlook or to turn a blind eye to the challenges that we have. We are fraught with challenges. Now going back a little into history, probably when we had attained our independence in 1947. In 1950 we had around 20 universities, around 500 institutions, a teaching faculty strength in our country of around 15,000, and a gross enrollment ratio of 1% in higher education. Today, we have a little over 31,000 colleges. We have around a large number of not only the private universities, but even the private universities. We have a teaching faculty strength of around anywhere between 500 to 600,000 of them, and our gross enrollment ratio today into higher education is around 18%. This is not to forget that we are abysmally low when we look at our gross enrollment ratio of 18%, when the world average is around 23%. So we are seized of the reality that we do need to improve our gross enrollment ratio into our higher education institutions if we need to have a sustainable economic growth. Because economists strongly believe that if any country needs to have a sustainable economic growth, then the gross enrollment ratio into the higher educations must be anywhere between 20 to 30%. But having said that, aren't the governments doing sufficient enough is probably the question that would come to the fore in many of your minds seated before the dais, or probably even on the dais today. 6% of the GDP is what we dream to allocate to the education sector within our own country. And quite often, we've heard people criticize the fact that we haven't been able to reach the 6%, and we are anywhere between 3 to 4%, 3.89% if my numbers are correct. But let's not forget that the 6% is public expenditure on education that we are looking at. And when I say public expenditure on education, it simply does not restrict itself to the expenditure which the government of India or the central government would be doing, but would also need state governments to step up their expenditure on education as well. It is only then when state governments partake in the expenditure that we are doing or the allocations that we are doing for education in our country that we cannot reach or achieve the 6% that we would want to spend on education itself. Government of India in its own jurisdiction is trying its best, but again, education being a state subject, we do need state governments to support or supplement the endeavors of the central government as well. It is here that I would like to acknowledge the positive role that is played by the private sector. Quite often, again, we do hear from corners that the efforts of the private sector is not recognized and is not duly appreciated. That, I think, would be far from reality. We do appreciate the efforts of the private sector in stepping in to supplement the efforts of the governments, be it central or state government. I do not think that without the effort or the support of this private sector, would we have been able to achieve the 18% that we are looking at. Of course, there could be a few within the flock which could bring a little notoriety to the private sector. But beyond that, I would once again like to voice our appreciation to the private sector. But of course, this is not overlooking probably the various judgments of the Supreme Court as well, which says that education cannot be a commercial activity. Now, having said that, to the young generation seated before the dais who are about to step out into a larger responsibility, what is it that we expect from you is probably the question that you need to ask yourselves and you need to answer yourselves. Today, when we look into India, it is very ironical that on the one hand, we believe very strongly that here is an economy, here is a nation that is going to take the 21st century by itself. It is not simply what we believe, but there have been several surveys, survey after survey, which said that 21st century is going to be the century of Asia and more particularly the century of India. Barring a few upheavals probably in our country, the surveys have reiterated that India is definitely going to grow to be a super economic power of the 21st century. But within that, even as we love to believe that we are growing at a consistent global GDP rate, despite the economic gloom that spreads all over the world today, well, in 2008, despite the economic downturn, we did grow at a consistent growth rate of anywhere between 7 to 8%. However, in the Eurozone crisis, we did dip to a little between 5 to 6%, but still, that when we compare ourselves to the developed nations who have crumbled under the weight of the global economic downturn, I think India did do fairly well to that extent, though we know we need to do much more. So for a country at whom the entire world is actually looking at today, whose confidence strides are said to be pacemakers for the countries of the world. Within our own country, when we do a little introspection, we know for a fact that we have islands of excellence in a sea of underdevelopment. We need leaders at every stage who would help us to bridge that gap, who would help us to bring Bharat and India together, who would don the leadership role to ensure that they definitely would like to take the blue chip industry forward, but yet would also like to improve the productivity of the small and medium enterprises in our own country. I would like to believe somebody who said that leaders do not do different things, but they do things differently. It is here that when we go back a little into history, about 50, 60 years ago, it was the British Morris Oxford that was selling their cars to the Indian roads as the ambassador. But today, it is the Tata Indica which is being sold to the London roads as the City Rover. And how did this happen? This happened because of the leadership role that was taken by the industry, coupled with the conducive policies introduced by the government. And it is that kind of leaders that we in India are looking forward to, and we are sure that we would have leaders emerging from those of you sitting in front of the dais. We need innovators, and though I speak of innovation second, innovation should be a top priority. I was listening to Professor Rao, the director, when he mentioned about the special attention that BITS has been giving to innovation, and I congratulate BITS for having done so and for doing so as well. Now when I talk of innovation, there is an incident of which one of my very dear friends had faced that comes to my mind, and I would love to share this with the young generation seated before the dais. This acquaintance of mine was actually the chairman of a committee that was interviewing candidates to the position of a